Hi, thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece, Declassified. Episode 4, Sappho, the 10th Muse. You're about to hear some lyrics from a pop song. Some of you will recognize it right away because it's by a very famous singer-songwriter. We're talking Beatles-level famous. If you don't recognize it, see if you can at least guess from its style and theme what decade it's from. Here we go. And that sweet laugh makes the heart in my chest jitter, for when I glance your way, my words dissolve in thin air. My tongue breaks into silence while a flame runs through my skin. A darkness fills my eyes. I hear a buzzing from within. As you may or may not have guessed, the songwriter in question is Sappho. As for the decade, she lived 260 decades ago. She's one of the first songwriters we know of in history, partly because she was one of the first singers to write down her songs, in around 600 BC. We still know about her because she was considered the best songwriter for like 1,000 years after her death. Think of your favorite singer or band today. Can you imagine them still being popular in the year 3016? When's the last time you heard music that's hundreds of years old? Later in this episode, you will hear a song that's almost 3 millennia old. Now, in the previous episodes, we talked about how 500 years before Sappho, the civilizations around the Mediterranean had suffered a collapse so cataclysmic that the knowledge of writing was lost, in some places for hundreds of years. During the ensuing Dark Ages in Greece, only a faint memory of the past was kept alive by bards singing epic tales of a long-lost world. But finally, in the 700s BC, after 400 years of no written records, writing comes back. With a vengeance. This is when the familiar Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, first appears. And the amazing thing is that it just starts popping up everywhere. From Italy to Greece to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. It's as if someone flipped a switch and all the lights came on everywhere at the same time. One reason it spread so quickly may have been that this new technology of alphabetic writing was the simplest and therefore easiest writing system the world had yet known. All you had to do was learn 24 letters, as opposed to many dozens or hundreds of symbols, and you could spell out any words or even sounds you wanted. It should come as no surprise then that all kinds of people started making use of this new technology, from record keeping to writing down song lyrics, and we even find graffiti from this time period. And so for the first time, artists started writing down their poems and songs and signing their name on them. This may be the first time we see something like people claiming intellectual property, which they needed to do because with writing, popular songs could spread amazingly fast. And this could be why Sappho mentions her own name in her lyrics. Among other reasons for doing that, it would have served like a watermark, a stamp of authorship that couldn't be erased. So anyone who performed a cover of her songs was also advertising her name. And already in her lifetime, her songs were performed as far away as Sicily. So just over a century after writing re-emerges, at the dawn of authorship, we find this woman named Sappho on the island of Lesbos, singing of love and despair, life and death, longing and desire, often directed at other women, hence our modern term lesbian. But her lyrics were so powerfully felt by men and women across the centuries that she became known as the 10th Muse, joining the ranks of the 9 divine muses, the goddesses of art and inspiration. Her little island of Lesbos at that time was actually a musical powerhouse and produced another superstar songwriter named Alceus. After their deaths, these two songwriters became legendary, literally entering the realm of myth. Later, stories emerged imagining the two singers as lovers, forming a kind of musical power duo, like Beyoncé and Jay-Z. People back then thirsted for juicy stories of celebrities, just like we do today, and so the myths became more and more dramatic over time. One myth even has Sappho ending her life by hurling herself off a cliff into the sea because of unrequited love. I mean, what more poetic way to go than that? Especially if there was a beautiful sunset in the background. But after a millennium of celebrity status, Sappho's works were almost completely lost. Of the 9 volumes of her songs that once graced the shelves of libraries at Alexandria and elsewhere, only a few pages survive today. Most of it just scattered bits and fragments of different songs. But even these fragments of her poetry continue to inspire artists today. If you've heard of the novella by Salinger called Raise High the Roof Beam, Carpenters, that's a direct quote from one of her fragments. And new fragments are still discovered once in a while on scraps of papyrus. So scholars today who try to understand this phenomenon that was Sappho have to be, of course, experts on poetry, but at the same time they have to be detectives who try to put the pieces together into a coherent and plausible picture. With us today to talk about Sappho is such a detective/scholar, and one with a totally epic name. Andromache Karanika, professor of classics at the University of California Irvine, has written extensively on Sappho and early Greek poetry, and she joins us to talk about the 10th Muse, her life and works, and why they were lost. Andromache Karanika, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's talk a bit about the island of Lesbos where Sappho was from, because this tiny island somehow produced a lot of great artists. In addition to Sappho, we hear of the singer Alcaeus, sometimes pronounced Alcaeus, and also of Arion, the singer who was supposedly rescued by a dolphin when he was thrown off a ship by sailors that wanted to steal his money. So 3 superstar singers, all from this island around the same time. So was Lesbos like the hippest place to be in 600 BC?
If Lesbos looked at that time anything like it looks today, absolutely. It is just an unbelievable landscape. The island was buzzing with commercial and cultural activity in 600 BC. And I like to think of all these artists being inspired in part by the beautiful landscape around them.
And it was close to the very rich Lydian Empire, just you could see it across the sea. So was that like a place of connections between the Greek and the Eastern world?
Totally. In fact, to the Greek mind, Lesbos is very much the representation of the Eastern world. At the same time, Mytilene had a very intense political landscape, and I really wish we could know more about it, but we're trying to be real detectives and find out through very cryptic references from Alcaeus or Sappho about these shifting alliances among aristocratic clans. There's a fragment of a poem in which Sappho speaks harshly of a friend of bad character for supporting a rival clan. Alcaeus must have belonged to a different clan, and he certainly refers to the island's political turmoil in his poems.
So there were 3 kind of independent city-states on the island. There was Mytilene and Mithymna and Eresos.
And the legend goes that Sappho may have been born in Eresos, but this must have been more connected than we think. So it's very possible that Sappho and Alcaeus actually met on some kind of, cultic, theatrical stage where they both performed.
So we have 3 rival cities, various rival aristocratic factions. There's a rich power to the east, the Lydian Empire. There's a lot of political and cultural competition in all directions, and that's where Sappho is born into. So do we know anything about her early life and upbringing?
Actually, there is a very interesting biographical tradition about Sappho, but we also have to put it in a context, because biographical tradition of poets was, for archaic poets, was dominated by a desire to find in their poetry, as it survives, a kind of a perspective or a window in their lives. And this was very much the case with Sappho. We are told that she had a mother whose name was Claes, and also a daughter with exactly the same name. We get from a Byzantine encyclopedia from Suda different names for her father. And there's also the tradition that she had 3 brothers. What is really interesting is that Herodotus reports that Charaxus, her brother, engaged in trade and had commercial dealings with Naucratis, the city in the Nile Delta in Egypt. And so we see that Lesbos is put in this crossroads. Certainly across from the Lydian Empire, but also very actively involved with commerce with places as far as Egypt.
So there's a danger when you look at this biographical information we have that a lot of it was just extrapolated from the works of the artists themselves. Mm-hmm. So we have this medieval Greek encyclopedia called the Suda Lexicon. And although it's from over 1,000 years after Sappho's time, the people that compiled it, they had access to a lot of materials that we don't have. So it is valuable in that sense. But I'd like to read the first line, which says, Sappho, daughter of Simon, others say of Eumenes, others say of Eurigius, others say her father was Ecritus, others Samus, others Camon, others Etarchus, and others say it was Scamandronymus. And then after that line it says her mother was Claes. So there's no doubt there. It must have been one person.
Exactly. A lot of what we know about Sappho comes from androcentric sort of environments and views later. And the fact that the mother is known, but many names circulate about who her father was, could possibly reflect on how the ancients thought about paternity, the very uncertainty of paternity. Anxiety about who the father is, not who the mother.
Right. So Sappho was known throughout history as a singer of love and desire, often directed to other women. And so scholars have been theorizing about the social context that these songs came out of. Some want to see her as singing about her love for other women, and others have seen her as a kind of teacher or leader of a young woman's circle. So what do her fragments tell us about her social circle and her relationships?
Sappho certainly operated in women's circles, possibly elite circles, possibly ritual circles, we're not exactly sure. But she certainly addressed women, and she's the poetess who addressed more than anyone the transition from girlhood to womanhood. In Sappho's poetry, there's a lot of emotion, and there's a lot of passionate love, but there's also disappointment. So I think Sappho suffers a lot from projection. We can very easily project all kinds of emotions or experiences of love, both heterosexual as well as homosexual. And I think her poetry lends itself to this kind of projection. I think we limit it if we just look at it from one side. I think it's certainly far more universal as the experience of love.
Sappho names herself in some of her poems. She actually uses her own name and puts herself in the context of the song, and yet some scholars still say that we should not read this as the real Sappho, but as a kind of poetic persona. What is your take on that? Is the Sappho named in the songs the actual Sappho, or is it a kind of persona?
I like to think of both. I mean, it's very difficult for me when you have a name to simply think of it as a persona. But at the same time, I think these names are meant to reflect a more universal experience. A parallel that one can think of is when we look at the choral part in tragedy. There is a leader there in the chorus, and they often say I, but every time we hear the I from the chorus, we understand very easily that this is a we, and we actually see that on stage. So I like to think of Sappho's name as a kind of a mask, and a mask that includes her real persona as well as her poetic persona.
This mask, or persona, of Sappho in these poems expresses emotions of love and desire for other women and also other men.
Right. It's both.
So there's been a long-standing debate on the topic of her sexuality. Some embrace her as a lesbian artist. Others have tried to argue, especially in older literature, that she was heterosexual. Do you want to say something about the topic of her sexuality?
There's a lot of fluidity in Sappho's persona and how she expresses her emotions. The norms we like to call homosexual or heterosexual, and they're both sort of portrayed in Sappho's poetry. I mean, there are moments where some of the evidence even like to bring Alcæus and Sappho together, a little bit like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez of their time at the island of Lesbos. But at the same time, Sappho deeply communicates the female anxiety towards marriage. A marriage that, did not operate in any romantic terms that we might want to see today. In fact, quite the contrary. That happened way too early for most women in ancient Greek settings, including Lesbos. Sappho certainly communicates this anxiety, the female anxiety. And the best audience is other women.
Unfortunately, we no longer have any women's reactions to Sappho's poetry from antiquity. All that survives are reactions from men, often expressing great admiration. For example, we have the story of Solon, the lawgiver of the Athenians, the guy who wrote much of the constitution of Athens, and apparently he was at a banquet one time when he heard one of Sappho's songs, and he liked it so much that he asked the singer to teach it to him. And the singer said, "Why?" And Solon said, "So that I may learn it and then die," implying that this divine song would somehow complete him. And a later poet wrote, quote, "A hollow tomb bears Sappho's name and holds her bones, but her wise sayings are immortal." So what was it about her work that endured over so many centuries and found so many admirers?
It's the universality of emotion. It is precisely that behind that Sappho's I, that poetic persona, that we can substitute the we.
And in a poem attributed to Plato, Plato says that Sappho is the 10th muse. So he's saying that she rises above the other human singer-songwriters, and she's actually part of this divine realm of poetic inspiration.
Yeah, it's interesting that while Plato was praising Sappho, and while much later we have the stories about Solon admiring her, at the same time, there is also a tradition of literally not leaving her alone. There was a late 5th or possibly even early 4th century play called Sappho, attributed to a certain Amapsias, which very possibly targeted Sappho. So we have two trends there. On one hand, praise, and on the other hand, blame.
So going back to the biographical entry for Sappho in the Suda, the medieval Greek encyclopedia mentioned earlier, we get this account there that she married a man named Cercillus of Andros. And scholars have argued that this was probably just taken out of one of these later comedies that made fun of Sappho. So how do we know that?
Well, Sappho, just like Socrates, was featured on comic stage, and comic poets must have torn her apart, just as Socrates was torn apart. This is kind of what was going on the democratic theatrical stage. The name Kerkylas is very suspicious because the word kerkos in Greek is actually a slang for penis. And Andros, the place where supposedly Kerkylas comes from, Andros goes back to the root and means man. So I think that the encyclopedia there recycled an old joke. This might have been an old joke from old comedy that Sappho was married to a prick of a man, or something like that. That's how we can translate this Kerkylas name in contemporary slang.
Yeah, that's definitely very different than what we get from Plato and Solon. But overall, in the balance of things, over the centuries, would you say that the balance tips more toward the positive, admiring side, or to this kind of ridiculing of Sappho?
Totally on the positive, admiring side. And there's no better admiration than imitation. She was studied very well in the Hellenistic times, and parts of her poetry survive in different forms or are echoed through other poets. Also in the Roman times, and I think that is what testifies really more than anything to the beauty of her poems, and also how it resonated with different tastes across different places and different times.
So Sappho was one of 9 super famous singer-songwriters of the ancient world. The other 8 were all men, and many of them came after her, and as you say, they were inspired by her, they emulated her in some ways. But still, we have this one female voice, and we have all these other male voices, and they're all writing kind of similar length songs about love and emotion. But is there anything unique to Sappho's poetry that points to like a female voice? Like, is there anything about her poetry that seems both unique to her and part and parcel of the female poetic voice?
Yes, well, I think there's something very, how can I say it without sounding weird, very girly in her. She preserves, I think, more than any other author from the ancient world, a voice of childhood. And that is quite unique that she brings.
So, can you give an example?
Okay, I'll give an example of one of my sort of favorite shorter poems. And that is a poem where we have a dialogue. So this sapphic I is saying, "Virginity, virginity, where have you gone deserting me?" And then in the apostrophe, the other person responds, "I will no longer come to you, I will no longer come to you." I mean, this is a 2-line fragment that basically summarizes much of what is happening with Sappho's poetry. We have lament. She laments the loss of her virginity. That could have been a wedding song, but at the same time, it is performed as a game, as a kind of a game of tag.
So it's a kind of give and take between different singers, or?
Possibly. We can't really exactly tell how it was performed, but it could have been a duet of some sort.
So this brings us to the issue of how these songs were actually performed, which is one of the big mysteries because of, the very little evidence. So some scholars like to see her as singing by herself with her lyre. Others say these are choral songs. She has a chorus performing with her. So what's your take?
I cannot think of Sappho performing by herself. I think more people must have been involved. Possibly there would be a lead singer, or there would be even a dialogue between 2 lead singers. I mean, some poems seem to bring 2 distinct voices, and maybe this could be 2 people performing and possibly choruses behind them, or even possibly 2 different choruses being more engaged and many voices conjoined as one. And there must have been musical instruments. She constantly makes reference to musical instruments, and all the testimonia that we have seem to bring that there was almost a competition between what is it, the human voice that is better or the instrument's voice.
And once again, going back to this Suda encyclopedia entry for her, it says that she actually invented the pick with which you pluck the strings of the lyre. So she might have been a real musical innovator in terms of instruments.
Yes, yes. She mentions her instrument in her songs. In fact, she speaks to her lyre, which is pretty wonderful, and calls it by the name Kellis.
And what does that mean?
Kellis literally means a turtle or a turtle shell. And it sends our imagination back to the story about the god Hermes first inventing the lyre by stretching strings over a hollowed out turtle shell. So by calling out to her lyre with this name, she also evokes that mythical realm.
So could Sappho have been the chorus leader and say there's a really big wedding on the island, rich family, they get the most famous singer to come, and that's Sappho. Are we to imagine Sappho showing up with a chorus of girls and leading them in a song and dance performance? Is that how it happened?
I think so. She would have been a lead singer that everybody would have wanted at their banquets or weddings, and possibly would have paid large sums of money to get her. She would very likely have come with others from her circle to accompany her singing. But she was so famous, her songs were already so well known that even if she showed up alone, a local chorus might likely be able to accompany her. Just imagine if Bob Dylan were to show up at a wedding where there was a live band. He could just walk on stage and any band would be able to accompany him, at least for his more famous songs.
Right. Now today, when we think of songs or poetry today, we usually associate it with rhyme. When we hear lines that rhyme, we think, oh, that sounds like a song or a poem. But neither the Greeks nor the Romans really ever used rhyme as the essential feature of their poetry. So if these lyrics are not rhyming, what is it about the language that makes it poetic or musical language and not just regular speech?
Rather than having rhyme, as we have today, what creates musicality is a rhythmical pattern, a pattern that contains shorter and longer syllables in a certain combination, and that whole combination is then repeated again and again. Unlike English, every syllable of every word in Greek is either short or long. So by arranging words in a certain order, the singer can create a rhythmical sequence of long and short syllables. So what listeners would have enjoyed and admired when listening to Sappho songs is the skill with which she chooses words and arranges their order such that line by line the same rhythmical pattern emerges again and again, all to the accompaniment of music, of course.
Well, we can actually hear this pattern today because a friend of the podcast has created a modern reconstruction of how the famous fragment known as 31 would have sounded like. But before we listen to that, let's actually get into the poem a little bit just to see what Sappho is talking about in this poem. So would you mind taking us through what this short song is saying?
Mm-hmm. He seems as fortunate as the gods to me, the man who sits opposite you and listens nearby to your sweet voice and lovely laughter. Truly, that sets my heart trembling in my breast, for when I look at you for a moment, then it is no longer possible for me to speak. My tongue has snapped. At once a subtle fire has stolen beneath my flesh. I see nothing with my eyes. My ears hum. Sweat pours from me. A trembling seizes me all over. I am greener than grass, and it seems to me that I'm a little short of dying. But all can be endured, since even a poor man... ...
And then it cuts off.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So In the first stanza, the female voice that's speaking sees a man and a woman talking. Are they flirting with each other and she's looking at them? Or what's the scene that is being described here?
Well, it has been highly contested as to exactly what was going on. It could very well be that the sapphic eye is looking at a wedding scene, at a bride and groom. I actually think so, because the beginning, he seems to me really echoes very typical wedding discourse. I mean, it is very typical at ancient weddings to talk about what the bride or what the groom looks like. So, and also to have a simile of the bride or the groom as a god. So he seems to me like a god, really points me to a wedding context.
But then she shifts the focus to the woman in the picture.
Exactly.
Who's talking to this man who looks like a god.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the physical symptoms of love, we could say, that she feels pertain to her.
Exactly.
So we have this kind of triangle of psychology going on here.
Right. One can think of different scenarios here. The woman, let's call her Sappho indeed, secretly watching the couple, is in love with a young man or the young woman he is with. Many have thought of her being jealous, but it is a complex scene. In epic poetry, it's usually the sight of an enemy on the battlefield or a monster that causes characters to feel such terror and awe. Sappho completely rewrites these norms. Here she shows how a subtle and intimate scene can provoke just as powerful and paralyzing an emotional response as can the sight of an Achilles charging at you in battle.
Wow. Now, the reason we still have this song is that it was quoted by an author named Longinus, who we actually encountered briefly in the previous episode. So his work survived, and he loved to quote earlier authors, so thanks to him, we have a lot of fragments of earlier stuff that doesn't survive otherwise, like Sappho. So he quotes this poem as an example of sublime language, and what he admires about it, he says, "Isn't it amazing how these seeming contradictions..." Sappho says that she feels a fire in her skin, but at the same time she's shivering as if cold. She says that she's raving, but at the same time she's very articulate in how she expresses her emotions. So Longinus greatly admired how Sappho was able to unify these seemingly contradictory symptoms of love and put them all together in this beautiful whole. Does scholarship today appreciate Longinus' take on this?
I think this juxtaposition of completely different reactions is certainly appreciated. For Sappho, love is bittersweet, and that is throughout her poetry.
Great. Well, let's have a listen to a recreation of this song recorded exclusively for this podcast. And as far as I know, it's the only reconstruction of Sappho's song that stays true to the original rhythm of her text. Just to clarify for our listeners, the melody is not Sappho's. We'll probably never know, sadly, how her melody sounded like. The melody is a medieval composition written for Sapphic verse. But we do know the rhythm of her songs and, to some extent, the pronunciation of words. And this version is going to follow both. Let's check it out.
Dautika chro pyrypa de dromeken
Wow. This is beautiful. Two quick comments. I think it brings really as accurately as possible this alternation of short and longer syllables to make the pattern of her meter and also give a sense of rhythm. And my second quick observation, I mean, the voice, the female voice that sings this is just gorgeous. And there is a subtle sort of instrument in the background. So I actually think it really brings this beautiful competition between the instrument and the voice. The sweet voice is superior to the instrument. No offense to the person playing there. It really complements. I mean, they complement each other very, very well, but they do come distinct too.
Well, that's awesome. I'm really happy to hear that, because I think that was precisely the intention of the singer.
No, it's very beautifully done.
So that is one of the longer fragments we have. But a lot of the stuff we have is just tiny bits, a few words or a few lines. When you look at these little bits here and there, can you really hear her voice coming through? I mean, is it possible to appreciate her art even from these small fragments?
Yes, we see in Sappho's voice a kind of fresh, genuine kind of voice, very direct, in ways that we do not see in any other corner from the ancient world. Which is why I really think that Sappho's voice, to a certain extent, resembles a child's voice, one that is able to articulate emotion in very, very crude terms. So there's something there that is very appealing and sounds like a voice coming from even an earlier phase of our life, kind of.
Right. Here's a one-line fragment, number 52 in the Anne Carson edition. Quote, "I would not think to touch the sky with two arms." Mm-hmm. That also strikes me as kind of childlike, and beautiful, this kind of whimsical, creative way of thinking about the world that most of us grow out of, but we admire artists that can still channel that voice.
Right. And in another fragment, that's fragment 102, again, we have very much a young woman's voice where we have a weaving scene. One can think of two women, one younger, one older, weaving together, when at some point the younger voice makes the bold announcement, "Mother, I can no longer weave, for I am overcome with desire for a boy because of slender Aphrodite." When a voice in Greek literature addresses someone as mother, then you know this is the voice of a child, one about to grow up. This is what we call a coming of age scene. And in this case, despite the mask of desire, this poem presents a moment of interruption. Interruption for a woman's life can be all sorts of things, but they're not usually very nice things. One could be a wedding, another can be death. Many epigrams or tombstones refer to interrupted weaving, usually to show untimely death. Think of the figure of Penelope. She weaves by the day, completely undoes it by the night. If her weaving was to be interrupted, that would mean either marriage for her or death for her or Odysseus, her husband.
Right. One word that we find in a lot of these tiny fragments is the moon. Mm-hmm. There's something about the night sky, sometimes the stars, usually the moon, that, judging from the fragments that survive, Sappho made a lot of use of. So what is it about the moon that you think captivated her?
I think there's something liberating with the moon. One suggestion is that Sappho and her circle of friends would get together at night and would perform some of these songs. But then again, that is reading too much autobiography through her poetry. So I'm a little bit, I'm not so sure that this is true. But the moon is, the night setting opens up the space for fantasy, opens up the space for play, opens up the space for loss of restraints. And that is possibly why it is so inviting to Sappho as a literary space to use. Fly me to the moon.
Oh yeah, that's good. Now, the big question hanging over this entire discussion is what happened to Sappho's works? Even 1,000 years after her death, the 9 volumes of her work that we hear about seem to have still been intact. Today we're working with fragments. What happened?
What exactly happened is not easy to determine. There were certainly fires and floods that destroyed some libraries. It's also possible that her poetry appeared more and more foreign to readers as time went on. Her dialect of Greek was already 1,000 years old and difficult to understand for Greeks living in late antiquity. Another possibility is that because of the nature of her poetry, much of which is erotic or homoerotic, it may have met with disapproval from, say, the church fathers, and maybe even a more deliberate effort to make her work disappear. So all kinds of different factors may have contributed to the loss of the majority of her work.
The other early Greek songwriters, they didn't fare much better than Sappho.
Exactly.
We have even less of some of them.
Exactly. No, it's almost a miracle that we have what we have. So the transmission of Sappho is not unique when we see it in comparison with other poets of different genres. And certainly if you compare what survives from, let's say, Alcæus, to take a contemporary of hers, coming from the same place, it's roughly comparable of what we have. I'm sorry, because for someone who excited the ancient imagination so much, one would have expected more.
Now, in the past 12 years, there have been some astonishing discoveries of new Sappho poems, found on papyrus fragments, some in Egypt, some in old dusty archives. In 2004, a poem was discovered labeled The New Sappho, until even newer poems were discovered. And in 2014, 2 new large fragments mysteriously appeared in London. And there's been a lot of controversy about these 2 because the person who found them has chosen to remain anonymous. We don't know exactly where they come from. So with so much uncertainty about the papyrus, are you confident that these are in fact genuine Sappho poems? Mm-hmm. There was the famous case of the so-called Gospel of Jesus' Wife papyrus in 2012. Mm-hmm. And it was making headlines for a very long time and then turned out to be a hoax. So, could this be another hoax?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, and precisely because we have been so excited that, suddenly our knowledge of Sappho has become so much greater. I think this is real. I think this is a genuine Sappho poem. The papyrus has been subjected to a lot of scrutiny, even archaeological analysis. We know it is an ancient papyrus, no question about it. That doesn't exclude the possibility that it could be some kind of ancient forgery, or it could be somebody else imitating Sappho's style. But I think that this is genuine. It really reflects earlier stories that we know about Sappho criticizing her brother. We see a lot of Sappho's voice in that, and it agrees with what other references we have.
Are you hopeful that more poems could be potentially discovered?
I am, in the sense that it was such an extraordinary discovery. And if you think of Sappho's transmission overall, there is hope that more could pop up. It might be 2 lines, but 2 lines for Sappho is a lot. And if I can get a little bit more to fill in the gaps of some of the poems we have already, that would be amazing. I mean, I would love to see what happens next to that girl in that fragment we mentioned earlier, who tells her mother that she can't weave anymore because she's in love.
I also would like to know what happens next. On that fragmentary note, Andromache Karanika, thanks for coming on the show and making these fragments really meaningful.
Well, thank you so much. It has been a real pleasure.
In the next episode, we'll look at how the Athenians designed the first democracy, dealt with demagogues, and boosted their economy, with one of the world experts on ancient Athenian democracy, Josiah Ober. In the meantime, join the conversation at greasepodcast.com. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming episodes, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram with the handle @greasepodcast. And if you like what you hear, leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks for listening to Ancient Greece, Declassified.
Can you still sing Orpheus? Then sing something that's going to last. 1,000 years slips by so fast, goes off into a dusty myth with you.